The night Elias Colt pressed his back against a pine tree and told 3 women he'd never met that he would not move until sunrise. Not one of them believed him, and yet by morning, every single one of them knew he was a man who meant every word he said. It was the summer of 1874, and the overland trail through the Colorado Rockies had swallowed more than a few wagon trains whole. The passes were unpredictable, the weather turned without warning, and the men who haunted the timberlines between Pueblo and the high country were the kind who did not ask before they took. But none of that was what made the Calloway sisters tremble when they pitched their canvas tent on the grassy flat beside Cottonwood Creek, 2 miles west of a rough settlement called Harrow Gulch. What made them tremble was the sound of a man's boots in the dark, the smell of cheap whiskey on the wind, and the memory of what had happened to their wagon 3 nights before. The 3 Calloway sisters had left St. Louis in March of 1874 on the back of a dream that belonged to their late father. James Calloway had sketched it all out on a piece of brown paper before the consumption took him. A homestead in the San Luis Valley, 160 acres under the Homestead Act, good soil and tall grass and a clean start, far from the noise and the grief that had settled over their Missouri home like a second skin after their mother passed 2 winters prior. He had filed the paperwork, paid the fees, and made them promise, all 3 of them standing around his iron-framed bed with their hands clasped together, that they would go, that they would take it, that they would not let his dream die in a drawer. So they went. Nora Calloway was 26, the eldest, and she carried herself the way women who have been responsible for others since childhood tend to carry themselves, straight-backed, clear-eyed, and quietly exhausted in a way she never allowed herself to name. She had her father's dark brown hair and her mother's gray eyes, and she was the one who drove the wagon, read the maps, negotiated with the ferryman, and made sure the flour barrel was always tied down before they forded any creek. She was the one who had made the decision to keep going after their lead ox broke a leg in Kansas and they had to sell half their goods to afford a replacement. She was the one who hadn't cried since St. Louis. Clara was 22 and built from softer material, which was not a weakness, only a difference. She laughed easily and grieved hard and had a gift for finding beauty in places that had none. She had once spent 20 minutes describing the color of a Kansas sunset to Nora, as though painting it in words could make them both forget they hadn't eaten since noon. Clara braided wildflowers into her hair when she found them and kept a small journal in her coat pocket, and she was the one who had first noticed the mountain man at the edge of camp that evening, because she noticed everything. The youngest was May, who was 18, and had the kind of quiet that ran deep. She did not say much, but when she did, it landed. She was the best shot among the 3 of them, having learned on their father's old Sharps rifle out behind the barn in Missouri, and she was the one who had fired a warning shot 3 nights ago when the 2 men from the Harrow Gulch camp had come too close to their wagon in the dark, drunk and loud, and looking for trouble. The shot had sent them scrambling, but it had not ended the matter. They had seen the men again the following morning on the road, watching from the tree line with flat, patient expressions that said the matter was only postponed. That was why the sisters had pulled off the main trail and camped on the far side of Cottonwood Creek, hidden behind a ridge of young aspens, hoping distance would buy them peace. They had made a small fire, eaten their corn mash, and were in the process of deciding who would take first watch when Clara looked up from her journal and said very quietly, "There is a man standing at the tree line." Nora reached for the Sharps without looking up. "How many?" "1," Clara said. "He hasn't moved." May was already at the tent flap, her hand on the rifle she'd propped beside the canvas door. She looked out into the blue dark of the early mountain evening, where the aspens made pale columns against the deeper shadow of the pines behind them, and she saw him. He was enormous. That was the first thing, the sheer, unmistakable size of the man. He stood at the edge of the tree line with his arms loose at his sides, not reaching for anything, not moving toward them, just standing. And even from 50 yards in the fading light, May could see the width of his shoulders, the solid column of his chest, the way the trees behind him seemed to shrink. He wore a heavy canvas coat despite the summer warmth, dark with trail dust, and his hair was dark and long enough to brush his collar. He had a rifle slung across his back and a knife on his belt, but his hands were empty, and his posture was, against all expectation, almost careful. "He's just standing there," May said. "Men who just stand there are sometimes the most dangerous kind," Nora said, coming up behind her with the sharps cocked and ready. She stepped out of the tent and faced him across the open ground, and she called out in a voice that did not shake, because Nora Calloway did not allow her voice to shake. "You want something? You'd best state it plain and then move along." There was a pause. The creek murmured behind them. The aspens whispered. Then he walked forward, not fast, not aggressive, but steady, the way a man walks when he wants to be clearly seen, and stopped again at 20 yards, where the last light of the sky was enough to make out his face. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, with a jaw that looked carved from the same granite as the mountains behind him, and dark eyes that took in the whole scene in one unhurried sweep. There was a long healed scar along his left jawline. His hands, she noticed when he held them away from his body in a gesture of open intent, were the size of supper plates, rough and scarred and calloused to the bone. "Name's Elias Colt," he said. His voice was low, measured, the kind of voice that had no need to raise itself. "I'm not a threat to you. I want to make that plain before anything else." "You can want a lot of things," Nora said. "That doesn't make them true." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He nodded toward the road behind him. "I was coming down from the high country and I stopped at Harrow Gulch to resupply. 2 men there were talking about 3 women traveling alone. The way they were talking about it was not the kind of talk a decent man ignores." The silence stretched. "What kind of talk was it?" May asked from behind Nora. Elias looked at her, then back at Nora. "The kind that ends with someone getting hurt," he said. "I followed their trail to where they'd been watching the road, and I followed it to here. I'm not going to pretend I know your situation, but I know theirs." He paused. "I've dealt with men like Garrett Foss before." Nora's expression changed slightly. "You know his name." He was loud about it. "Foss and his partner, a man named Dutch Crane. Both of them have warrants in New Mexico territory." He said it without drama, the way a man recites facts he'd had time to turn over. "I'm not asking to come into your camp. I'm not asking for a meal or a place to sleep. I'm only telling you that those 2 men were on the road not 3 hours behind me when I left Harrow Gulch, and that I'd feel easier in my conscience if I spent the night on this side of that tree line." Nora studied him for a long moment. Behind her, she could hear Clara breathing and May's quiet steadiness, and she trusted both of them the way only sisters can trust each other, completely, wordlessly, across the silence between them. "Clara," she said without turning, "what do you think?" It was not the question most people would have expected from the eldest sister, but the Calloway women had always made decisions together. Clara appeared at the tent flap, journal still open in her hand, and looked at Elias Colt with the kind of direct, unhurried attention she usually reserved for sunsets and the pages of her books. "I think," she said slowly, "that a man who wanted to do us harm would not have announced himself." "People do all kinds of things," May said. "They do," Clara agreed, "but I also think that a man who had bad intentions would not have ridden toward the sound of a rifle the way this one clearly did." Elias said nothing. He just waited. Nora lowered the sharps by a fraction, not all the way, not yet, and said, "You stay outside. You don't come into the camp. You don't speak to us unless we speak to you first, and you don't move toward the tent between now and sunrise." "Agreed," he said. "And if those men come," she added, "you will tell us before you do anything." He held her gaze. "I'll do better than tell you," he said. "I'll make sure you don't need to be afraid of them again." She almost said something sharp in response to that. She had a finely tuned instinct for promises that were bigger than the men making them, but something in the absolute steadiness of his voice stopped her. She held his gaze for 3 more seconds, then stepped back toward the tent. "All right, Elias Colt," she said. "Stay if you feel you need to." He nodded once, walked back to the tree line, and sat down with his back against a pine, his rifle across his knees, and he did not move. Inside the tent, the 3 sisters lay close together in the dark, listening to the creek and the wind and the occasional shift of Elias's boots against the dry ground outside. May fell asleep first, which surprised no one. Clara lay awake for a long time, writing in her journal by the dying light that came through the canvas, and Nora lay perfectly still and stared at the dark ceiling of the tent and thought about the strange mathematics of trust, how it was built and how it was broken, and how sometimes, in the wilderness, it arrived unannounced and sat down against a pine tree and refused to sleep. She woke twice in the night. The first time, a sound from the direction of the road had made her sit upright and reach for the rifle, but before she could make sense of what she was hearing, Elias's voice came through the canvas, low and calm. "Coyote," he said, "about a quarter-mile northeast. It's gone now." She lay back down. The second time, just before the sky began to lighten in the east, she heard something different. 2 horses, slow and deliberate on the far side of the creek, and then the sound of a man's voice, low and conspiratorial in the way drunk men think is quiet. She sat up again. May was already awake beside her. Clara had stopped writing. Then they heard Elias stand up, the sound of him rising from the ground, the shift of his weight, the solid press of his boots, the way the ground itself seemed to register his full mass, was not a threatening sound. It was, somehow, a reassuring one. He did not reach for his rifle immediately. He walked to the creek bank and simply stood there, and even in the near dark he was visible enough and large enough that the 2 horses stopped. A voice from across the creek said something low and ugly. Elias said, "Move on." Just that. 2 words, in a voice like a closing door. There was a long silence, then the sound of horses turning in the mud. Then, nothing. He came back to his tree, sat down, and did not speak again. In the morning, when the sky had turned from gray to gold and the birds had started in the aspens, Nora came out of the tent and stood in the cool air with her arms folded and looked at him. He was sitting exactly where he had been all night, his back against the pine, his long legs stretched out before him, his dark eyes alert in a face that was drawn with tiredness but gave nothing else away. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No. You sat there all night." "I did." She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her chest, quiet and unfamiliar, like a door opening in a room she had kept locked for a very long time. She pushed it back. This was not the time for things like that. "Coffee," she said, "if you want it." He looked at her then, and for the first time since she had seen him, something shifted in his expression, not a smile exactly, but the suggestion of one, something warm and human moving underneath the granite surface of his composure. "I would be grateful for it," he said. She turned away before he could see whatever was happening to her face. Clara made the coffee, because Clara always made the coffee, and she made it the way their mother had taught them, strong enough to stand a spoon in and sweetened with the last of their brown sugar, because it was morning, and they were alive, and those facts together seemed worth celebrating. She brought Elias's tin cup to him where he still sat at the tree line, which he hadn't crossed even now, and when she handed it to him, she studied his face with the same frank, unhurried attention she gave to everything, and said, "You are very loyal for a man who doesn't know us." He accepted the cup with both hands. "It's got nothing to do with knowing someone," he said. "A thing is right or it isn't." Clara looked at him steadily. Then she smiled, the full, unguarded smile that Nora always said was their most dangerous family trait, and said, "I think we are very lucky you came down from the mountain last night." He didn't say anything to that, just looked down at his coffee, but Clara noticed that the tips of his ears went slightly red, and she filed that away in the part of her mind where she kept things that were too interesting to forget. May came out last with her rifle slung over her shoulder by old habit, and she walked past Elias without a word and went down to the creek to wash her face. He watched her go, then looked back at the road, checking the angles the way a man does when security has become a reflex rather than a thought. Nora brought her own cup and stood a few feet from him, and they drank in silence for a while, which was the particular kind of silence that means something is being decided without words. "We're heading to the San Luis Valley," she said eventually. "My father filed a homestead claim before he died. 160 acres near Alamosa." He looked up. "That's good land, the San Luis Valley. You know it?" "I've trapped up and down the Rio Grande drainage for the last 8 years," he said. "Know every pass between here and the New Mexico line." He paused. The road you're on will take you through the Sangre de Cristo passes. It's rough going this time of year. Early summer storms can close the trail for days, and there are stretches that are not safe for a wagon traveling without outriders. Nora said nothing, but the line of her jaw tightened. I'm not saying it to frighten you, he said. I'm saying it because it's true. Everything about this journey has been true, she said. That hasn't stopped us yet. He looked at her then, and the thing she saw in his face was not pity and not condescension and not the complicated mixture of admiration and skepticism she usually got from men when she spoke plainly. It was something simpler than all of that. It was respect. No, he said quietly. I don't imagine it has. They broke camp an hour later. Elias stood back while the sisters struck the tent and packed the wagon with the efficient economy of 3 women who had been doing it for 4 months and had worked out the system down to the last rope knot. He did not offer to help until Nora looked at him over the top of a heavy crate and said, "The flour barrel goes on the right side, or the wagon lists." And he came forward without ceremony and lifted the flour barrel, which weighed a solid 120 pounds, with one hand and settled it in its place with the care of someone handling something precious. May looked at Clara. Clara looked at May. Neither of them said anything, but an entire conversation passed between them in the glance. They were ready to move by mid-morning, the wagon hitched to their 2 remaining oxen, the horses tethered behind. Nora climbed to the driver's seat and picked up the reins. Then she looked down at Elias, who was standing to the side with his own horse, a big, rough-coated gray that looked like it had been bred for mountain country, and she said, "You're heading south?" "I was going to Pueblo," he said, "but Pueblo can wait." She held his gaze. "You don't need to do that." "I know." Another silence, the kind that had a weight to it. The morning sun was coming over the ridge and it lit the aspens gold and threw long shadows across the grass, and somewhere in those shadows, the right thing to say was hiding. But Nora had never been good at finding the right thing when it came packaged in the complicated wrapping of gratitude and pride, and something else she was not yet ready to name. "You may ride with us," she said finally, in the tone of a woman who is granting a concession and is aware that it is also a surrender, "if you intend to be useful." Elias Colt looked up at her on that wagon seat, her dark hair pinned back under a sun-faded bonnet, her gray eyes steady and her jaw set and her hands firm on the reins, and something happened to his expression that he did not entirely manage to control. He had spent 8 years in the mountains alone, mostly by choice, because the mountains did not lie to you or disappoint you or leave you for someone more convenient. He had been to war and come back from it and found that the world of men no longer fit the shape he had made of himself in the high country. He had thought he preferred it that way. He was beginning to reconsider. "I can be useful," he said, and swung up onto the gray. The road south climbed steadily from the moment they left Cottonwood Creek, winding up through pine and aspen forest, where the trail was narrow and the switchbacks were steep enough to require all of them working in concert. Elias on horseback ahead to check the grade, Nora handling the oxen with a skill that consistently surprised him, May walking the outside edge to watch the wheels, Clara calling measurements where the trail narrowed past the wagon's width. They worked well together, the 4 of them, in a way that had nothing to do with planning and everything to do with paying attention to each other. On the first midday break, camped on a rocky outcropping above a valley that stretched blue and hazy to the south, Elias built a fire, and Nora made biscuits in the cast-iron pan, and nobody said much of anything, and that, too, felt like a kind of trust. Clara used the time to draw him, quickly in her journal, the angle of his profile against the mountain view, the way he sat on a boulder with his forearms on his knees and his rifle leaned against his side, always within reach. She drew him with the careful attention she gave to things she found genuinely worth recording, and when she looked up from the page, he was already looking at her with an expression that was more than a little amused. "Most people don't find me worth drawing," he said. "Most people don't look closely enough at things to find them worth drawing," she said simply, and went back to her page. He smiled at that, a real one this time, and Nora, sitting on the other side of the fire, looked up from the biscuit pan and saw it, and looked quickly back down. The afternoon brought the first real trouble of the trail, which arrived in the form of a section of road that had been washed out by the spring snowmelt, a gap of 8 or 9 feet where the track had slid down the mountainside, leaving a raw scar of gravel and red earth. The wagon could not cross it. The horses could pick their way around, but the oxen would not, and abandoning the wagon was not an option. Elias dismounted and walked the gap for a long time, crouching, measuring, pressing his hands into the gravel to test its stability. May came and crouched beside him, and they talked in low voices about grade and drainage and weight distribution, and Nora stood back and watched two people she would not, 3 days ago, have imagined consulting with each other, work out a problem with the focused, collaborative intensity of people who had been doing this kind of thing all their lives. It took 2 hours. Elias cut timber from the downslope side of the trail and lashed it across the gap with rope, creating a rough bridge that was not elegant but was, he judged, strong enough. He drove the wagon himself at Nora's insistence, not because she doubted her own ability, but because she had watched him handle the gray over rough terrain and understood that he had a specific kind of precision in his hands, a fine-gauge sensitivity to weight and balance that made him the right choice for that particular task. When the back wheels cleared the gap and the wagon was on solid ground again, all 4 of them stood there for a moment in the particular silence of people who have accomplished something difficult together, and then May said, in the dry tone that was her version of enthusiasm, "Well, that's one way to spend an afternoon." Elias laughed. It was the first time Nora had heard him laugh, and it was the kind of laugh that came from deep in the chest, unguarded and real. And it did something to the air around them that was entirely unreasonable and, she told herself firmly, entirely irrelevant to the business of getting to the San Luis Valley. They camped that night on a high meadow where the grass was thick and the creek was clean, and the mountains rose above them in every direction, blue-white with snow even in June. Elias set the camp while the sisters made supper. He picketed the horses, dug the fire pit, checked the tree line, walked the perimeter in a wide circle that was completely natural for him and slightly awe-inspiring to Clara, who watched it from the wagon and wrote about it in her journal. He came back and reported no sign of Foss or Crane on the trail behind them, and the information settled over the camp like a warm blanket. After supper, when May had cleaned the dishes at the creek and Clara had gone to write by firelight, Nora found herself sitting on a fallen log with Elias on the other side of the fire, and the talking came more easily than she expected. She asked him about the mountains, not because she needed the information, but because she wanted to hear him talk about them, because when he did, the hardness in his face went somewhere else, and what was left was something younger and more open and more honest. He told her about the high country above timberline, where the air was so thin and cold and pure that it felt like drinking water. He told her about the winter camps and the spring thaw, and the way the mountains changed color through the seasons like a slow, vast painting. He told her about a cabin he kept in the mountains above Trinchera Creek, a 2-room log structure he'd built himself over the course of 3 summers, and the way the valley below it looked on a clear October morning when the aspens were gold and the elk were moving through the meadows. He said it the way some men talk about a woman they love, with a reverence that was specific and real and unself-conscious. "You sound like a man who is very at home in the world," Nora said. He looked at her. "I used to be," he said. "It's different now." She waited, because she had learned that waiting was the most useful thing you could do when someone was deciding whether to say a true thing. "I came back from the war different," he said, without drama, just as fact. "A lot of men did. Some of them came back and rebuilt the thing they'd left. I found I couldn't. I went to the mountains because the mountains don't require you to be something you were before." She looked at the fire. "I understand that," she said. "Not the war, but the part about leaving something you can't go back to." "Your father," he said. She looked at him. She had not expected that. "You talk about him the way people talk about a compass," he said. "Everything you're doing, because he pointed you in this direction. That's a kind of love that doesn't need the person to still be there." Nora Calloway, who had not cried since Saint. Lewis, who had not allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd left and what she'd lost since the morning she'd packed the wagon and pointed the oxen west, sat by a mountain fire in the Colorado high country and felt something inside her chest give way like the washed-out section of road they'd crossed that afternoon. She did not cry. She was not yet ready for that, would not be for a few more days. But she felt it, the hairline crack, and she recognized it for what it was. She looked away from him, toward the dark outline of the mountains against the stars. "We should sleep," she said. "Early start tomorrow." "Yes," he said, and did not push, because he was a man who understood the value of not pushing. But he also did not sleep. He set himself at the edge of camp and kept his watch, and Nora, lying in the tent in the dark beside her sleeping sisters, was aware of him out there with a warmth she refused to analyze. The second day on the high trail was more beautiful and more dangerous than the first. They climbed into the Sangre de Cristos in earnest, the road narrowing to a thread above long drops that Clara did not look at directly, and May looked at with frank interest, and Nora looked at with the careful, calculating assessment she gave to all obstacles. Elias rode ahead and behind and sometimes alongside, but he spent most of the high-altitude sections on foot, leading the gray and walking at the head of the oxen team with his hand on the lead ox's halter, talking to the animal in a low, steady murmur that kept it calm on the exposed sections where the wind came up sudden and cold off the snowfields above. The oxen trusted him by the end of that day, which May said was a good recommendation for a person's character. Clara agreed. Nora said nothing but added it to the ledger she was keeping in the private accounting she was conducting on the subject of Elias Colt. They were 3 days into the mountains when the storm came. It arrived the way summer mountain storms do, with no warning that makes sense to lowlanders, though Elias had felt it in the air since noon, the way the pressure changed above timberline, and the birds went quiet before the visible clouds even arrived. He had said at lunch that they should find shelter early, and had led them to a broad shelf of rock and timber below a granite outcropping that would break the worst of it. They had barely finished pitching the tent and covering the wagon with the canvas tarpaulin when the sky turned the color of a bruise and the rain came down in walls. It was not a gentle rain. The Sangre de Cristos in early June had opinions about summer storms that flatlanders found instructive. The thunder bounced between the peaks with a sound like close artillery, and the lightning lit the whole mountain in flat white light, and the wind drove the rain horizontal and cold. The oxen were picketed in the lee of the granite overhang, and Elias checked on them twice in the worst of it, coming back both times soaked through, water streaming from his hair and his coat, and he stood at the tent opening and reported conditions without drama. The picket lines were holding, the wagon cover was secure, there was no risk of flash flooding on their shelf, and each time he came back, Nora had coffee ready in the tin cups and handed it out through the tent flap without a word, and he took it without a word. And that was the whole conversation, but it was complete. The storm lasted through the night and into the following morning, and they were pinned on their shelf while the world outside was nothing but gray and noise. Inside the tent, the 4 of them were closer than they had yet been, physically and otherwise, and the intimacy of it was something that could not be artificially created. It arrived because storms arrive, because weather does not care about propriety or the careful distances people maintain between themselves when they're still deciding what to make of each other. Clara read aloud from the one novel she had packed, a copy of Wilkie Collins that she had been saving, and her voice competed with the rain in a way that was pleasant and warming. May cleaned and checked her rifle with the methodical attention she gave to all mechanical things, and occasionally asked Elias a question about mountain weather or trail conditions, and he answered with the specificity of someone who has learned things the hard way and values the precise detail that makes the difference. At one point, in the early hours of the second night of the storm, when Clara and May were asleep and the rain had softened to a steady drumming on the canvas, Nora and Elias sat at the open tent flap together, she inside, he just outside, close enough to speak quietly without waking the others. And the conversation that happened in those hours was the kind that occurs only in the specific privacy that storms provide. She told him about her father's death, not the facts of it, which were spare and quick, but the texture of it, the smell of the sick room, the way the light came through the window in the afternoons, the specific quality of silence in a house after someone has left it. She told him about the decision to make the journey, how it had felt like both an act of faith and an act of grief, carrying his dream because they could not carry him. She told him that sometimes, in the flat stretches of Kansas, she had looked out over that impossible emptiness and felt her certainty falter, just for a moment, like a candle in a doorway. He listened the way very few people listen, without preparing his response, without redirecting, without trying to fix the unfixable. Just present, just there. When she finished, the silence between them had the quality of something shared. "My father served in the Mexican-American War," he said after a while. "He came back from it a different man than the one who left, and he never found a way to close the distance between who he'd been and who he was. He spent the rest of his life angry at things that didn't know he was angry at them." He paused. "I went to the mountains after the war partly because I didn't want to become him. I didn't want to become a man who directed his damage at the people closest to him." "Did it work?" she asked. "I think so," he said, "though the jury may still be out." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "It seems to me," she said, "that a man who drives strangers' wagons over washed-out mountain roads and sits up all night in the cold to keep them safe has probably resolved the question in his favor." He turned and looked at her, and the lantern light from inside the tent caught her face, the strong line of her jaw, the steadiness in her gray eyes, the slight softening at the corners of her mouth that was as close to a smile as Nora Calloway usually got, and Elias Colt, who had spent 8 years choosing the mountains over the company of human beings, felt the full weight of what he had been missing land on him like a sudden snowfall. He looked away. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll watch." "Elias." She used his name, and it was the first time she had, and it stopped him. "I will not sleep," she said, "so you might as well talk to me." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see the argument working in his face, the instinct to insist on her rest, the competing and stronger recognition that she was a woman who made her own decisions, and that arguing with her about it was both futile and condescending. "All right," he said, and they talked until the rain stopped. The storm cleared by mid-morning of the following day, and they emerged into the washed, brilliant world of the mountains after rain, every rock and leaf jeweled with water, the peaks above them pristine white against a sky that was the pure, impossible blue that only exists above 10,000 feet. The air smelled like pine and cold stone, and something mineral and clean that Clara said she was going to write about until she had found words good enough for it, which would take some time. They moved again down the long southern slopes of the Sangre de Cristos, and the country opened before them gradually. The passes softened into foothills, the timber thinned, and then one afternoon they came around a long ridge, and the San Luis Valley spread below them like a revelation. It was immense, flat and green and threaded with silver where the rivers ran, rimmed on every side by mountains that stood back from it in a great amphitheater. The Rio Grande wound through its center. The sky above it was enormous, a vault of blue that made everything beneath it feel both small and significant. Nora stopped the wagon, and the four of them sat in silence for a long time, looking at it. "There," she said finally, in a voice that was quieter than usual. "That's what he saw when he chose it." Clara reached forward and put her hand on Nora's shoulder, and May put her arm around Clara, and none of them said anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying. Elias sat on the gray at the edge of the group and looked not at the valley but at Nora, at the way her face had opened, just for that moment, in the high, clean air, and showed everything she had been carrying for months. He thought about the ledger she had been keeping on him, and he thought about the one he had been keeping on himself, and he wondered when the accounting had started to include something beyond what was practical and necessary. He thought about the cabin on Trinchera Creek. He thought about October mornings. He looked back at the valley and said nothing. They found the homestead claim on the third day in the valley, guided by the survey markers James Calloway had described in his notes with the careful precision of a man who had done his homework. It was on the east side of the valley, backed against the foothills of the Sangre de Cristos, with a creek running through the northwest corner and a stand of cottonwoods along the water that would provide timber and shade and a windbreak against the north winds of winter. The grass was deep and thick and richly green, and the soil, when Nora crouched and pressed her fingers into it, was dark and friable and full of the promise that her father had seen in the land agent's report and trusted his whole remaining life to. She stood up and dusted her hands on her skirt and said, "This is it." May walked the boundaries, slow and deliberate, counting paces and checking the corner stakes. Clara sat in the grass and looked at the mountains and wrote 4 pages without stopping. Elias unloaded the wagon and began laying out the camp with the organized efficiency of a man who had established 100 temporary camps and understood that a good beginning made everything easier. That evening, around a fire built on their own land, and that phrase, their own land, was something Nora said softly to herself twice, trying the weight of it, the 4 of them ate a better supper than any they'd had on the trail. Clara had found ripe currants along the creek and made a kind of sauce over the biscuits, and May had shot a sage grouse in the late afternoon with the economical precision that characterized everything she did, and Elias had set up a spit over the fire and roasted it in a way that suggested his years in the mountains had made him a cook of some competence. "You can do a great many things," Clara told him as she ate, watching him over the fire with that frank, assessing gaze of hers. "Mountain life doesn't leave much room for incompetence," he said. "You're going to have to give us a full accounting," she said, "of everything you know how to do. We have a homestead to build." Elias looked at Nora across the fire, and in his look was a question that went considerably beyond the practical. Nora met his gaze. Something moved in her chest that she recognized now, that she was beginning to stop trying to suppress. She looked down at her plate, and then she looked back up and she said, "If you're willing." He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. The creek ran. The mountains stood in all directions, holding the valley in their long, slow arms. "I'm willing," he said. He stayed. It was not a decided thing, not formally, not in the way that required a declaration or an agreement beyond the one that was already understood between people who are working toward the same end. He stayed because there was work to be done and because he knew how to do it, and the 3 Calloway sisters were brave and capable and determined and also had no experience building a log structure from scratch, which was what the homestead required before the first Colorado winter arrived. Elias Colt had built a cabin before. He had built his own on Trinchera Creek over 3 summers, learning from mistakes and from the old trappers and from the land itself, and he knew the principles, the foundation, the notching, the chinking, the roof line, the way a door frame had to be set plumb, or winter would make it unworkable. He began with the foundation logs at the end of the first week, and the sisters worked beside him in the way they had worked beside him on the trail, without fuss or ceremony, learning the task as he explained it, asking good questions, doing the difficult parts without complaint. May turned out to be the strongest worker, physically, which surprised precisely no one who had spent any time with her. She could swing an adze for hours without flagging, and she had an eye for the plumb and level that made her invaluable in the framing work. Clara was less interested in the heavy labor, but possessed an organizing intelligence that made her the natural manager of supplies and timelines, and the carefully maintained list of what they needed and what they had. Nora could do anything. That was the truth of it. If a task needed doing, Nora did it, and she did it well, and she did not stop until it was done. Working beside her in the heat of the July days, Elias came to understand the shape of who she was with the kind of knowledge that only comes from shared labor. He saw her stubbornness and her competence and her humor, which was dry and arrived when you least expected it, and was funnier for that. He saw the way she checked on her sisters, the small, constant, almost invisible acts of attention and care that were so habitual she did not seem to notice she was doing them. He saw the grief she carried for her father, not as an absence, but as a presence, the way she would sometimes pause in the middle of a task and look out at the mountains with an expression that was not sadness exactly, but something more complex, gratitude mixed with loss, love mixed with determination, the kind of feeling that only exists in people who have been through something hard and come out the other side still whole. He fell in love with her the way snow falls in the mountains, quietly, steadily, and then all at once until everything was covered in it. He did not say so, not yet. The walls of the cabin were only waist high, and there was too much to do, and she was still carrying the weight of the journey and the grief and the responsibility for her sisters, and he did not think it was right to add his feelings to what she was already carrying. But he made sure she ate. He made sure she rested. He fought her over the heavy beams, diplomatically but firmly, because he had twice her muscle mass and she occasionally chose to forget this, and he read to her in the evenings from the almanac and the surveying documents, planning the homestead with the practical care of someone investing in a future, and he told her about the valley through the seasons, about the spring floods and the summer rains and the way the first snow came in September across the high peaks and worked its way down by November. And she listened with the total attention of someone building a mental map of a place they intend to inhabit for the rest of their lives. One evening in mid-July, when the cabin walls were chest-high and the framework of the roof was taking shape, they found themselves alone at the worksite after May and Clara had gone back to the camp tent for the night. The sun was going down behind the San Juan Mountains to the west, painting the whole valley in shades of amber and rose, and the half-built cabin cast long shadows across the new-turned earth, and Elias was checking the corner notches one last time by the fading light when he heard Nora behind him. He turned. She was standing a few feet away, holding a tin cup of water for him, and she was not wearing her bonnet because the day's work had long since sent it somewhere under a pile of cut timber, and her dark hair had come loose from its pins and was lying against her neck in the way that the end of a hard day will do to a woman's hair. And she was looking at him with those gray eyes in which he could now read a great deal more than he had in those first days on the trail. She said, "I want to tell you something." He waited. "I've been trying," she said, in the careful, considered way she said things that mattered to her, "to be sensible about you." He said nothing. He held very still, the way he held still when something important was happening. A Neiro. "I have been reminding myself," she continued, "that you are a man who came out of the mountains and will go back to them, and that we met because I was afraid and you were decent, and that gratitude is a feeling that can masquerade as other feelings, and that I have 2 sisters depending on me and a homestead to build and a great many practical concerns that should occupy my attention." She paused. "I have been doing a great deal of reminding." "And," he said. She held out the cup of water. "And it is not working," she said. He took the cup from her. Their fingers touched on the tin, and the touch was so careful and so deliberate that it was very much more than the accidental contact of people who have been working together for weeks. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the valley was golden around them, and the mountains were turning purple in the last light, and Elias Colt set the cup down on the corner of the unfinished cabin wall and said, "Nora?" "Yes," she said. "I am not going back to the mountains," he said. "Not the way I was." She looked at him. "I have a cabin up on Trinchera Creek," he said, "that I built for reasons I thought I understood at the time. I understand them differently now." He held her gaze, steady and direct, because he was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said. "I am telling you this so that you know I am not talking about gratitude, and I am not talking about something temporary." Nora Calloway stood in the fading light on the land her father had chosen for them, on the soil she had crossed 1,000 miles to reach, and she felt the last of the careful distance she had been maintaining dissolve like the morning frost on the mountain grass. "Then what are you talking about?" she asked, though she knew. "I am talking," he said, "about whatever you will allow me to say." She took one step toward him, which was all it took, and he met her in it, and when he put his arms around her, it was with the same deliberate care he gave to everything, not tentative, but measured, as though he understood that this was something that needed to be held correctly. She pressed her face against his chest, against the rough canvas of his coat, and she breathed in the smell of wood smoke and pine, and the particular clean scent of mountain country that had come to mean, somewhere in the last weeks, something like safety. "Then say it," she said into his chest. He said it. Quietly, completely, without ornamentation, just the plain truth of it, in his low, carrying voice, against the top of her head. And she said it back, with the conviction of a woman who does not say things she does not mean, and the mountains held them in their long arms, and the sky above the San Luis Valley went from rose to violet to black, full of stars. Clara and May, walking back from the camp for no particular reason they would ever formally acknowledge, saw them from a distance and immediately reversed course. And May said, "Finally," in the tone of someone whose opinion has been confirmed, and Clara pressed both hands to her mouth and did not write anything in her journal that night because some things were too good to reduce to sentences. The cabin took the whole of the summer, and Elias worked on it as though it was his own, which, by the slow accumulation of choices and conversations and shared evenings by the fire, it was becoming. He and Nora did not rush what was between them. They let it grow the way good things grow in mountain country, slowly, with deep roots tested by weather. They talked every evening when the work was done, long conversations that ranged from the practical to the philosophical and back again. And in them Elias found the thing he had not known he was looking for when he went to the mountains, a mind that matched his own, in the best sense, not identical, not an echo, but a genuine counterpart, a different quality of intelligence that engaged with his and illuminated things he had not previously seen clearly. He told her about the war, not all of it, and not at once, but in the measured portions that were possible when the trust was good. He had fought with the Union Army at Shiloh and Chickamauga, and had come home from it with a quietness that went all the way down, and the mountains had been the answer because they asked nothing of him that he did not choose to give. She listened to these things the way she listened to everything, without flinching, without trying to smooth them into something more comfortable. She took them seriously because she took him seriously, and that, more than anything else, was what love felt like to a man who had spent a long time in the company of peaks and silence. In August, they had a visitor. He arrived on a Tuesday morning when Elias was up on the half-framed roof and Nora was hauling stones from the creek for the fireplace foundation, a man on a roan horse, well-dressed by trail standards, with the manner of someone who considers his own time valuable. He introduced himself as Warren Holt, and he represented a land speculation company out of Denver that had been buying up homestead claims in the San Luis Valley from families who, he said, had found the work of keeping them more than they'd bargained for. He looked at the half-built cabin. He looked at the three women and the big man on the roof. He looked at the rich, deep grass of the eastern flat. He made an offer. Nora listened to the whole thing, arms folded, face expressionless. Elias came down from the roof and stood beside her without a word, which was its own kind of statement, and Warren Holt recalibrated his approach and raised the offer by 20%. "No," Nora said. "Miss Calloway, I wonder if you understand." "I understand perfectly," she said. "My father spent the last year of his life planning this homestead. My sisters and I have traveled 1,400 miles to reach it. We have been working on this cabin for 8 weeks. The answer is no." Holt looked at Elias, in the way men sometimes look at a larger man when they have been unable to get what they want from a woman, seeking a different avenue, an ally, a wedge. Elias looked back at him with the calm, total impassivity of a mountain and said nothing. Holt left. May watched him ride out from the doorway of the tent and said, "He'll come back with a better offer." "He can come back with whatever he likes," Nora said, and went back to hauling stones. He did come back once, in September, with an even better offer and a lawyer in tow, and the answer was the same, delivered with the same quiet certainty, and after that, the matter was settled. The cabin was finished in the last week of September, just ahead of the first frost. It was a solid, well-made structure, 2 main rooms and a lean-to for storage, with a stone fireplace that Elias had built with the careful attention of someone who understands what a mountain winter asks of a hearth, and shuttered windows that would hold against the wind, and a door that swung true in its frame. The roof was tight and the floor was level, and the whole thing sat on its foundation with the settled permanence of something that intends to be there for a long time. They moved the sisters' belongings in on a Wednesday afternoon, and that evening they sat inside around the first fire in the new fireplace, Elias and Nora and Clara and May, and the wood smoke rose through the new chimney, and the fire threw warm light across the log walls, and outside the first October wind was moving through the cottonwoods along the creek with the sound that wind makes when it has found its proper season, and everyone was quiet for a while, full of something that had no single name but felt, unmistakably, like home. May raised her tin cup and said, "To Father," and they all raised their cups and nobody said anything else, and it was enough. Afterward, Elias and Nora stood outside in the cold together, looking at the mountains in the silver blue of the early October moonlight. And she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders with the ease of people who have stopped needing to negotiate the distance between them. "I need to go to Trinchera Creek," he said, "before the passes close." She was quiet for a moment. "To your cabin. To collect what's there, some tools, my winter stores." He paused, "and to decide what to do with it." She turned her head and looked at him. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "that a man who intends to stay in the San Luis Valley through the winter has some arrangements to make and some questions to ask." He looked down at her. The moonlight lit his face, the strong jaw and the dark eyes and the long scar, all of it familiar to her now in the way that only the faces of the people you love become familiar, not just recognized, but inhabited. "I am not a man who is good at indirect conversation," he said, "so I will ask you directly." "Then ask directly," she said. "Will you marry me, Nora Calloway?" The wind moved through the cottonwoods. The fire inside threw light through the window. The mountains stood in the night sky above the valley like the oldest witnesses in the world. "Yes," she said, "I will." He kissed her in the cold mountain air, and it was not a tentative thing, because nothing about Elias Colt was tentative, and she kissed him back with the full force of someone who has made a decision and means it completely. And the October stars above the San Luis Valley were, as Clara would write in her journal the following morning, absolutely indifferent to their happiness and absolutely beautiful all the same. Elias rode to Trinchera Creek the following week, a journey of 2 hard days through the mountain passes, and he came back 5 days later with 2 pack horses loaded with tools and provisions and the various objects of a mountain life, traps and rope and carefully preserved stores of dried meat, and the few books he owned, and one item that he carried in his coat pocket and had retrieved from a tin box he'd kept under the floorboard of the cabin. His mother's ring, a plain gold band set with a small dark garnet, which she had pressed into his hand the day he'd left for the war, and told him to come back and put it on someone worth wearing it. He had carried it for 11 years. He had looked at it occasionally, in the years in the mountains, in the way you look at something that belongs to a future you are not yet certain you believe in. He put it on Nora's hand on the evening he returned, by the fire in the new cabin, with her sisters watching and not pretending they weren't, and the garnet caught the firelight and glowed like a coal, deep red and warm, and Nora looked at it on her finger, and then looked at him with those gray eyes that were not, he was relieved to see, in any way suppressing their emotion. "It was your mother's," she said. "She would have liked you," he said. "She liked people who didn't flinch." Nora smiled at that, a real, full, unguarded smile, the one she did not give easily, and therefore meant everything when she did. She put her hand against his jaw, against the scar, and held it there. "Tell me about her," she said. He did, long into the night, and the fire burned down, and the wind moved around the cabin, and the mountains were dark and silent outside, and the 4 people inside the house were warm and fed and safe, which was not a small thing, and was not to be taken for granted. And none of them did. They were married in November at the small town of Alamosa, which had a church and a pastor and a general store, where Nora bought a length of pale blue wool that Clara spent 2 weeks sewing into something that was not exactly a wedding dress, but was, in its own practical beauty, exactly right. May stood beside Nora, and Clara cried with the total commitment she gave to all her emotions. Elias stood at the front of the church in a clean flannel shirt and his best coat, with his dark hair brushed back and his face scrubbed, and the garnet ring in his vest pocket until the proper moment, and the pastor said the words, and they said theirs, not the standard recitation, but the real, specific promises they had made to each other in private, which the pastor had agreed to include, because, as he said afterward, he had never heard 2 people sound so entirely certain. Elias put the ring on her finger, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and it was, in its way, as quiet and as permanent as a mountain. They celebrated that evening at the home of a family named Reyes, good people, long settled in the valley, who had brought food enough for twice the company and made them all welcome in the generous, open-handed way of people who understand that community in a vast land is built one evening at a time. There was music, a fiddle and a guitar, and dancing, and Elias danced with Nora with the particular grace of large men who move well when they choose to move, and Clara danced with everyone, and May danced with no one, and then, late in the evening, danced once with the Reyes family's eldest son, a quiet young man named Raphael, who was 22 and had the same deep stillness that May herself possessed, and who, May told Clara quietly on the walk home, was not bad company. Clara wrote 6 pages that night. The winter in the San Luis Valley was, as Elias had promised, formidable. The cold came in earnest in December, dropping the nights to temperatures that turned breath to cloud and made the morning walk to the creek a serious undertaking. The snow came heavy and stayed, building on the mountain slopes and drifting against the north wall of the cabin and filling the valley floor in the deep blue-white silence of a Colorado winter. But the cabin was solid, the fireplace was generous, and Elias had laid in the winter stores with the experienced precision of a man who had spent 8 years not dying in the mountains, which turned out to be an excellent qualification for keeping 3 women and himself fed and warm through February. They developed the rhythms of a household, the 4 of them, and the rhythms were good ones. Elias managed the livestock and the firewood and the winter repairs, and Nora ran the domestic economy with the same clear-eyed competence she brought to everything. And Clara kept house and kept records and kept everybody's spirits up through the short gray days with the readings and the stories and the unshakable quality of warmth she carried in herself and deployed without thinking. May was the one who went out in the worst weather with the same composure she brought to everything, checking the stock and the wood supply and the fence lines, and returning each time with the face of someone who has been in conversation with the cold and found it no worse an interlocutor than most. It was in February, during a week of hard cold, when the thermometer outside the cabin door read things that made Nora wince, and Elias nod with the recognition of a man who had seen worse, that Nora told Elias in the evening, while the fire was burning low and the wind was working its way around the eaves, that she was expecting a child. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen before, not the careful steadiness or the alert watchfulness or the open warmth that she knew, but something that was all of those things together, and underneath them something raw and unguarded and vast. "When?" he said. "August," she said, "if I have the count right." He put his arms around her, and she put her face against his neck, and they sat there in the firelight for a long time without speaking, and the wind was doing everything it could outside, and inside was warm and quiet and full of the kind of feeling that words are always insufficient for. "A boy," he said into her hair. "I think." "You cannot possibly know that," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I think so." He was right. On a clear August morning in 1875, with the mountains showing their full summer face and the valley green and gold and alive with the sound of the creek and the meadow birds, Nora Calloway Colt delivered a son. He was a large, healthy, loudly opinioned child who arrived, as the midwife said, like a man who knew exactly where he was going. He had Nora's gray eyes and Elias's dark hair and the particular combination of stubbornness and capability that was the unmistakable signature of both his parents. They named him James, for Nora's father. Elias carried him outside in the first hours of his life, and stood on the threshold of the cabin and showed him the mountains, explaining to a sleeping infant the various peaks and their elevations with the same careful specificity he gave to all geographical information. And Nora, watching from the bed through the open door, laughed. A full, real, unguarded laugh, the kind that came from the deepest part of her, and Elias turned at the sound of it and smiled at her across the room with everything in his face that he had been, slowly and completely, giving over to her since a night on a pine-treed creek bank when he had decided not to sleep. Clara, sitting at the foot of the bed, wrote in her journal with tears streaming down her face and made no attempt to stop them. May held the baby and looked at him with the steady, appraising gaze she gave to all new things, and then she said, "He is very serious for someone so small." "He comes by it honestly," Clara said, looking at Elias. Elias looked entirely comfortable with this assessment. The autumn of 1875 brought changes beyond the baby. The homestead was fully established by then. The garden had produced well through the summer. The small herd of cattle that Elias had begun acquiring in the spring were fat on valley grass, and the first hay cutting was stacked in the lean-to beside the cabin. They were not wealthy, but they were secure, which in the San Luis Valley in 1875 was a more important thing. May and Rafael Reyes had by then reached an understanding that was characteristically unannounced, but entirely real. Rafael came to the homestead several times a week on various pretexts that nobody interrogated, and May went to the Reyes place on Sundays, and the two of them worked and talked and were together in the self-sufficient, undemonstrative way of two people who are equally suited to each other and equally disinclined to make a production of it. In October, Rafael asked Elias for a conversation, man to man, and Elias directed him to May, in terms that were both firm and amused, because May Calloway was the only person whose opinion on the matter was relevant, and she had made her own decisions since long before she needed anyone's assistance. May said yes. Of course she said yes. She said it the way she said everything, plainly, without excess, completely meaning it. They were married the following spring, and it was a good wedding, quiet and practical and full of genuine affection and the Reyes family's magnificent cooking, and May wore her hair down for the first time in anyone's memory, and looked, Clara said, like a painting. Clara herself was not lonely. She had made the world of the San Luis Valley her own in the way that Clara made everywhere her own, through attention, through connection, through the genuine interest she took in every person and place she encountered. She became, over those years, something of an informal chronicler of the valley. Her journals, carefully maintained, became a record of the community's life, and she was welcome in every home from Alamosa to the far ranches, because she listened well and wrote truthfully and never said a cruel word about anyone. She was, Elias said to Nora one evening, the kind of person that a place needs to know itself. Whether she was in love with someone was her own business, but Nora had noticed certain things, certain letters that came from a man in Santa Fe who was a schoolteacher and a naturalist, certain conversations that grew longer as the months passed, certain mornings when Clara came to breakfast with the particular glow of someone who has been lying awake thinking about something pleasant. She said nothing. Clara would tell them when she was ready. In the spring of 1876, young James Colt took his first steps across the cabin floor with the same determined, unstoppable energy he had shown in arriving in the world, and fell down and got up and fell down again and got up again, and Elias sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his arms out, and waited with perfect patience for his son to cross the room to him, which he eventually did, and stood holding on to his father's large fingers with his small ones, and looked up at him with those gray eyes and said, with complete clarity and no apparent effort, "Pa." Nora was standing in the doorway, and she saw it, and this time she did not push back what moved in her chest. She let it come. By that same spring, word reached the valley that Garrett Foss had been arrested in New Mexico territory on charges that were considerably more serious than the warrants Elias had known about. He and Dutch Crane had been taken by a marshal's posse near Taos, and the matter was concluded through the territory's justice, imperfect and slow as frontier justice tended to be, but concluded. Elias told the sisters quietly, with no drama, and it settled something in all of them that had been held slightly taut since the trail. "It's over," Clara said. "It was over when Elias sat down against that pine tree," May said, in the dry, certain tone that was her highest form of compliment. Elias said nothing, but Nora felt his hand find hers under the table, and she squeezed it, and he squeezed back, and that was all the commentary that was needed. The homestead grew. In the summer of 1877, Nora told Elias she was expecting again, this time with more certainty in her face, because she was not navigating the territory of early motherhood, and the experience of the first had given her a map of what to expect. She was 29 by then, with the settled confidence of a woman who has proved herself to the land and to the weather and to the challenges that the valley sent their way. And she carried herself with a kind of authority that had nothing to do with hardness and everything to do with deep competence. Elias had expanded the cabin by then, adding 2 rooms to the back with the same careful craftsmanship he had given the original. level floors and plumb walls and windows that let in the mountain light. He had a reputation in the valley as a man you wanted if you were building something or if something had gone wrong in the kind of way that required both strength and judgment, and he gave his help freely, the way men do in communities that understand that help given returns. He was also, unmistakably, a father in a way that Nora watched with a love that continued to grow in ways that surprised her. He took James on the horse with him when he rode the land, explaining terrain and weather and the behavior of animals with the same unhurried specificity he gave to everything. He read to him in the evenings the almanac and the naturalist's guides and the few novels they had accumulated, and James lay against his father's chest and listened with the complete, serious attention of a child who does not yet distinguish between types of knowledge. The second child arrived in early February of 1878, a daughter this time, a small, fierce, red-faced girl who announced herself at considerable volume and did not stop for several weeks. They named her Rose, for no one in particular, only because when Nora looked at her, she thought of the wild roses that grew along the creek in summer, stubborn and bright and impractical and absolutely right in their place. Elias held Rose the first night the same way he had held James, with the total careful attention of a man who does not take important things lightly. And he stood at the window with her in the winter dark and showed her the stars, because the mountains were not visible at that hour, and he told her about them with the same quiet thoroughness. And Rose looked up at the ceiling with the unfocused, ancient attention of newborns, and Nora watched from the bed and thought about all the things she would have missed if she had not gotten on that wagon in St. Louis, and all the things she would have missed if she had not lowered the sharps by a fraction on a mountain creek bank and allowed a man to stay. She was very glad she had. Life in the San Luis Valley in the late 1870s was not without its difficulties. The cattle market fluctuated with the uncertain rhythms of a frontier economy. A drought in the summer of 1878 stressed the grass and the creek and required careful management of the water rights that Elias had registered with the same foresight he brought to everything practical. A barn fire in the spring of 1879, contained before it reached the cabin, but devastating enough, set them back a season and required the kind of communal rebuilding effort that the valley was good at. Neighbors arriving with timber and tools and food and labor, the Reyes family prominent among them, May and Raphael working alongside Elias from morning to dark for 3 days, while Clara organized the meals, and Nora managed the children and the logistics with the authority of a general. They rebuilt the barn in 4 days. It was better than the original. Clara's situation resolved itself in the summer of 1879 in the form of a visit from the Santa Fe schoolteacher whose name was Thomas Aldrich, a quiet, thoughtful, bespectacled man who was deeply learned on the subject of southwestern flora and somewhat less capable on the subject of practical carpentry, a gap that Elias addressed helpfully over the course of the visit without commentary. Thomas and Clara walked the valley every morning and talked for hours, and the valley was clearly, in some way, passing judgment, because by the end of his second week, Thomas asked Clara whether she might consider Santa Fe, which had a good library and a strong school and an interesting community, as a place she might want to live. Clara said yes, with the particular quality of certainty she had shown all her life on the things that mattered to her. She was married in Santa Fe the following winter, and Nora and Elias and May and Raphael and the children made the journey south for it, and Thomas turned out to have a sister and a mother who were the kind of warm, intelligent, generous women who recognized the value of what they were gaining in Clara and said so plainly. Clara wore blue because it had always suited her and carried a small bouquet of dried wildflowers she had pressed from the San Luis Valley. And Thomas looked at her the way men look at the specific miracle they have been given and cannot quite believe. May wept, which she had not done at her own wedding and did not do at many things, and said afterward that it was only the altitude, which was not remotely convincing. By the summer of 1880, when the great cattle drives were reshaping the economy of the whole territory, and the railroad had extended its reach toward the valley, and the population of Alamosa had grown and taken on the character of a real town rather than a rough-edged settlement, the Colt homestead on the eastern flat had become one of the established, well-regarded ranches of the San Luis Valley. The land was fenced and managed and productive. The cabin had grown into a proper house with a porch that looked west toward the San Juan Mountains and east toward the Sangre de Cristos, and the two children played in the yard with the total oblivious freedom of children who do not yet understand how remarkable it is to be raised on land their grandfather chose and their mother claimed and their father helped build. Elias Colt was 38 by then, and the years of mountain and outdoor life had done what they do to men of his type. They had deepened rather than diminished him, the gray at his temples and the deeper lines at his eyes marks of experience rather than decline, the broad strength of his frame unchanged by time. He still went up into the mountains every spring and fall, as much out of love as necessity, trapping some, guiding occasionally for the Natural History Survey men who were beginning to work the region, mostly just being in the high country that had made him. But he always came back. He came back the way a man comes back to the place that is his center, his North Star, the place everything else orients around. Nora met him at the door each time he returned, and he came into the house and picked up the children and put his arms around her, and the house was full and warm and right, and he never failed to notice this and be grateful for it. In September of 1880, sitting on the porch on an evening when the aspens on the mountain slopes were full gold and the air had the particular cool clarity of Colorado autumn, Nora sat beside Elias, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they watched James and Rose chasing each other through the yard in the last of the light, and the mountains stood above them in the blue and gold of evening, and the valley was wide and still and full of the quiet industry of a good life. "Do you think about the mountains still?" she asked, "living there again the way you were?" He thought about it honestly, because he was not a man who gave dishonest answers. "Sometimes I think about the quiet," he said, "the specific kind of quiet that exists only above timberline." He was quiet for a moment. "But I think about it the way you might think about a place you loved before you found the place you love most, with gratitude, not with longing." She tilted her head and looked up at him. "This is the place I love most," he said, simply and completely. She looked at him for a moment with those gray eyes that saw everything. Then she turned back to the yard where James had caught Rose and was carrying her on his back while she laughed and directed operations, and she said, "I think Father would have liked you." "I hope so," he said. "I would have liked him." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "He was like you in some ways. He said what he meant. He did what he said he would do." She paused. "He would have been out here every morning in the garden and every evening on this porch looking at those mountains, and he would have been insufferable about how he had chosen correctly." "He did choose correctly," Elias said. "He did," she agreed. The light was going, the mountains turning from gold to violet, the first stars appearing above the eastern range. James had set Rose down, and they were lying on their backs in the grass looking up at the sky, which was what Elias had taught them to do at this hour, and their voices came across the yard in the clear evening air. James naming the constellations with the earnest precision of his father, and Rose inventing better ones with the confident creativity of her aunt. Nora laughed softly. Elias pulled her closer. The valley held them, wide and still, and the mountains were their walls and their horizon and their oldest witnesses, and the life they had made on the land James Calloway had chosen was deep-rooted and green and fully, completely, entirely theirs. 3 years later, in the autumn of 1883, Clara came back to the valley for a visit with Thomas and their infant daughter, a girl of notable opinions who had inherited Clara's gift for detailed observation and Thomas's gift for never losing an argument, and who spent most of the visit in the complete captivation of James, who was 8 by then, and took his responsibilities as the eldest cousin with the earnest seriousness of his father. May and Raphael came from their place up the valley with their 2 sons, dark-eyed, sturdy boys who could outrun the horses, and spoke with the easy bilingual fluency of children raised between 2 cultures. And for a week, the Colt house was full to its new capacity with all of the people that a decade of living in the right place had gathered. In the evenings, when the children were finally in their beds and the adults sat around the fire, Elias and Nora, May and Raphael, Clara and Thomas, 6 people who had arrived at the same place by very different roads, The conversation was the particular kind that belongs to people who have known each other long and well. It ranged and deepened and went quiet and grew warm and circled back on itself and was full of the easy, unself-conscious love of family. At one point, late in the week, Clara looked at Elias across the fire and said, "Do you know what I wrote in my journal the first morning I saw you, standing against that pine tree in the dark?" "I have a sense," Elias said, with the slight, contained smile that was his version of amusement. "I wrote," she said, opening the journal, which she had brought because she brought it everywhere, "that I had seen a man who looked like he had grown out of the mountain itself, and that I thought he was probably the most capable-looking person I had ever seen, and that Nora was doing a very poor job of not being interested in him." She looked up. "I was right on all 3 counts." Nora looked at her sister with an expression that was entirely composed. "I was not doing a poor job," she said. "You were doing an admirable job," Clara said. "It just wasn't working." Elias said nothing, but his expression was the warmest any of them had seen it, and his hand found Nora's on the arm of the chair between them, and she turned hers over and held it, and the fire was warm, and the valley was dark and still outside, and all of it was exactly right. May, who had been listening with the contained satisfaction she brought to things that had turned out the way they should, said, "I knew from the moment he stood up at the creek." "Knew what?" Thomas asked. "That he was going to stay," she said simply. "Men who are going to leave don't stand up the way he did." A silence fell, comfortable and warm, and the fire settled in the grate, and outside the San Luis Valley went on in its vast, quiet, mountain-rimmed life, and the night was full of stars. Nora looked at Elias, and he looked back at her across the firelight, and in his face was everything he had given over to her since the night he had sat down against a pine tree at the edge of a creek and refused to sleep until she was safe. The mountain man's steadiness, the soldier's patience, the builder's care, and underneath all of it, the full warmth of a man who had found his right place at last and knew it in his bones. She had known it too, since the morning she had come out of the tent in the mountain dawn and seen him sitting exactly where he had been all night. She had known it and spent a considerable amount of time pretending otherwise, which she thought was probably the most sensible thing she had ever done, and also the most unnecessary. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Outside, the mountains stood in the dark above the valley, patient and enormous and permanent, the way mountains are, and the creek ran through the cottonwoods along the northwest corner of the homestead, and the cattle were in the pasture, and the children were in their beds, and the house was solid on its foundation, and the fire was warm, and Nora Colt, who had not cried since St. Louis, felt her eyes fill with something that was entirely the opposite of grief, the overflow of a life so full it could not quite contain itself, and did not bother to push it back. She let it come. She had learned over these years with this man and this land and this family that the things worth feeling were worth feeling all the way through, that there was no virtue in keeping distance from the life you had chosen, that the heart's full accounting was not a weakness, but a kind of courage, the same courage that got you on a wagon in St. Louis, that kept you on the road when the ox broke down in Kansas, that stepped out of a tent in the mountain dark and asked a stranger what he wanted, and that, in the end, had been the truest and the best and the most life-giving thing she had ever done. She looked at Elias, and he looked at her, and he reached up and brushed the single tear from her cheek with his thumb, gentle as the touch of a man who knows the value of fragile things, and she caught his hand and held it there against her face. "All right?" he said, low, just to her. "All right," she said, "more than all right." He held her gaze, and in his dark eyes was the whole of it, the pine tree and the mountain dark, and the road through the Sangre de Cristos, and the cabin walls rising log by log, and the garnet ring, and October mornings, and James's first steps, and Rose's first laugh, and every evening on this porch, and every morning in this valley, all of it present in the way that the past becomes present when it has been good, when it has made you into something truer than you were before. He brought her hand to his lips, and she leaned against him, and Clara wrote the last line in the journal she had started that night on Cottonwood Creek, when she had looked up from the page and seen a man standing at the tree line and had thought, with the instinct of someone who paid close attention to the world, that something was beginning. She had been right. Outside, the San Luis Valley lay under the autumn stars, the mountains dark and still and ancient all around it, holding what it held, the homesteads and the rivers and the people and the lives, with the permanent, impartial care of things that were there before and will be there after, and do not need to be thanked for it, but are, in the marrow of every person who has ever looked up at them and felt the world make sense, thanked nonetheless.